So you're looking to buy an RTX 3080, despite all the shortages right now on this awful launch, as well as all the issues from scalpers basically price gouging it by reselling it on eBay. But you still want to buy an RTX 3080, and you don't have time to read all the reviews, so which ones do you have to buy and which ones to avoid? And there's also the emerging issue of some of the partner cards having problems with crashing to desktop, so we'll also discuss that in this video. But I don't have the card themselves on hand, I just have all the information that I gathered from reading all the reviews. Although I won't explicitly intentionally show the results of the reviews on this video one by one, because that would be just taking all the work that the reviewers have done and taking it away from them by posting it on my own video. So I'll leave the links down below in the descriptions if you want, then read all the reviews that I've read as well. But anyways, let's take a look at all the options we have first. Basically, all the reviews that have come out on the RTX 3080 are based around the the Founders Edition RTX 3080 from Nvidia, the Asus TUF Gaming RTX 3080, the MSI Gaming X Trio, the Zotac Trinity, the Palit Gaming Pro, and the Gigabyte Eagle OC or the Gaming OC. Either way, they are pretty similar. But yeah, that's basically all the cards that has been reviewed already. The EVGA XT3, which is the dual slot triple fan solution from EVGA, I haven't really seen the proper review of that yet, so I can't really say anything about that too much yet. Although Jay's 2 cents, I think, have tested that, and it seems to be a pretty decent card, but there's no a long in-depth review of that card yet, so I'll be skipping that for now. So first, let's take a look at the Founders Edition Nvidia RTX 3080. Now, this card is a dual fan cooling solution that's in a 2-slot form factor from Nvidia themselves. And by now you should have already known this card because it's a pretty popular card and it was super hyped up for its really unique design with the fans on the opposing sides of the cooler instead of on the same side like on most graphics cards. Well, on this GPU, you have a very unique cooling solution in which that Nvidia calls it a flow-through solution, which has the back fan sucking air through the heatsink fins and blowing it upwards, and then also have the bottom fan on the rear side of the card blowing air through the PCI bracket out the back, and I guess also slightly through the fins in the middle of the card out and around the case. So it is still mostly an open air style cooler in which that it blows heat around the case. And it's also a dual slot solution, which is more compatible with more cases, especially like ITX cases. Although it has to be said that this might not be the most ideal card for ITX solutions that are in a sandwich style because of the rear fan that might be blocked off in some cases. Anyways, this card has a pretty powerful VRM solution from Nvidia, although it is not the most powerful one. That goes to the Asus TUF Gaming for now. So first off, the one that's more important aside from the cooler is that the Nvidia Founders Edition uses a 15-phase MP monolithic power system powered VRM. And it uses DR MOS components, which is power stages, just like all the other cards actually on the RTX 3080 these days. And it's basically a 50 amp by 15 phase power stage VRM setup, so it is pretty powerful, and I really doubt that anyone could overpower it and explode it, even if you overclock it, especially since you can't really bypass the power limit at this point in time, and also you can't overvolt it. So VRMs are actually not super important when picking a 3080, but hold on to that thought because that's not the end of it, because there's other things that you have to keep in mind, especially in light of the crashing issues. But anyways, for the VRM setup on the Founders Edition, it seems to be a pretty solid setup, and it has a pretty adequate power supply as well. So it's not like the Founders Edition is the weakest. It's actually not the weakest. It's more like in the middle of the card designs compared to the other cards. But yeah, and it also has some GDDR6 modules around the card that are really close by. One of the problems with the Founders Edition is that the VRAM does get quite toasty, probably as a side effect of Nvidia trying to make it super quiet and the kind of unique cooling system that they use on this card, which doesn't really provide that much active airflow onto the board itself. So it does reach 100+ degrees on the VRAM, which according to Igorslab is above the GDDR6X safe temperature, or like right at the limit. So I would say that if you want a long-lasting card, maybe you should avoid the Founders Edition because it does run quite hot. Although he did say that you could use some thermal pads to fix that potentially, but it's not a surefire way to fix it, and I'm not sure why Nvidia didn't check this before they launched this to release. But yeah, so the Founders Edition seems to be also the hottest running card out of all the cards from the partner boards, but that's kind of expected because it's the smallest card as well. It's only a 2-slot and it only has 2 fans instead of the triple fans of the other cards. So if you want the Founders Edition card, you just have to keep in mind that it might not be the quietest and it might not be the coolest running card out of all the bunch. Although it does not seem to have the crashing issues that people have reported. At least not a lot of them from what I have seen. So it might be one of your best bet. Now, moving on, we have the Asus TUF Gaming RTX 3080, which is, I think, actually one of the best RTX 3080s that you can buy right now at launch because it has the strongest VRM setup. It actually has a 60 amp power stage setup, which is put in a 16 phase. So it has an absurdly strong VRM setup, and it also has one of the most advanced coolers that you can buy for an RTX 3080, in that it has a big main cooler and it also has a VRAM cooling plate that's separate. They actually have a dedicated memory cooling plate, as you can see from their marketing slides on their website, that actually cools the VRAM separately from the main heatsink. So I think they acknowledge that they do run hot, and with this card, the Asus RTX 3080 TUF Gaming is actually one of the coolest running cards for the RTX 3080. It's actually the coolest from all the reviews that I've seen, and it's also the quietest running card at the same temperature as the other cards, even though this one also has an increased power limit of 340 watts compared to the Founders Edition, which is 320 watts. And the only other card that has an increased power limit is also the MSI Gaming X Trio. Now, the Asus card also has the strongest VRM, so if you're looking to overclock this and modify the card or whatever, this might be your best bet because, well, it has the strongest VRM at 16 phase by 60 amps, which is a lot more than the reference design. Although at this point in time, like I said, maybe overclocking potential is not that important because these cards really don't overclock too much as their power and voltage limited by the Nvidia driver as of right now. Now, if you want the quietest and the best card, I guess, again, you get the Asus because they also don't cost that much more than the reference or the Founders Edition. I think it would be a no-brainer to pick the Asus RTX 3080 TUF Gaming if you have a choice of getting them. Now, the next card you have is the MSI Gaming X Trio for the RTX 3080. Now, the thing is with this card is that it has a triple 8-pin setup for the power, which is quite annoying to say the least because it really doesn't need it. Now, this card has a pretty decent VRM setup, but honestly it's kind of mediocre in that MSI basically just slapped on the reference spec of a VRM, which is 13 phase by 50 amps, so it's actually even weaker than the Founders Edition card, yet they put a triple 8-pin for some reason, which I think it's just for a marketing gimmick because even the power limit, if you overclock, MSI doesn't have a high power limit for that you can increase. I think their maximum, from what I've seen on reviews that have tested it, like from Tech Power Up, which they do really great testing of the power limits potential of the cards, and even on Firmark to see the maximum power consumption of the cards, the MSI card doesn't really have a lot of headroom for the power limit because, like the Asus cards, they let you move it up to 375 watts, and the Founders Edition, they let you move it up to 370 watts, while the MSI card is the same as the Palit Gaming Pro, which I'll get to later, at 350 watts. So I don't even see a reason why MSI had to use the triple 8-pin when a dual 8-pin would have sufficed. It's just going to make people more annoyed having to put 3 8-pin power connectors and making it look uglier with more cables. Although maybe some people think it looks more powerful. I don't know. Maybe it's just a marketing gimmick. But yeah, the MSI card is not my favorite card because just purely because of the base spec VRM and also the triple 8-pin that's super unnecessary. And for the heatsink, it seems like the MSI card also doesn't impress because despite the big cooler that MSI has used on the card, it doesn't cool as well as the Asus cards, and it even falls behind the Zotac cards, which is quite disappointing. And it's probably because MSI decided to use a direct touch heat pipe design instead of using a copper base plate on the heatsink. In terms of temperatures and noise level, the MSI card is actually pretty decent, so if you're not looking to overclocking it or pushing it beyond the stock setting, which it has a 340 watts stock power limit just like the Asus card, so the stock settings it's gonna run pretty decently. It just doesn't have the potential to overclock as high as the Asus or the Founders Edition because of the limited power limit, even though it has a triple 8-pin. Now the next card we have is the Zotac RTX 3080 Trinity, and I have to say I am really disappointed when I see the review of these cards because Zotac's philosophy for this card seems to have been cut down everything they can to save costs as much as possible on this card, just to make it as cheap as possible to make. Zotac cut a lot of corners on this card, especially on the VRM setup, which they have used the base spec again, just like MSI did, but they also cut out some capacitors to use the cheapest one, which has some pretty bad results, as I'll get to later, because all the cards I've mentioned previous to this, like the MSI and the Asus, they have no problems, like as in they don't have that many people reporting crashing issues that I've seen. Like I haven't really seen them, but the Zotac one has been the one that has been criticized to have the crashing issues on the RTX 3080. And the reason is that Zotac has basically removed the expensive MLCC capacitors from the behind the card. At least that's a speculation right now, and basically use mostly the cheaper POSCAP capacitors. That because of that, the Zotac card seems to have the most problems out of all the RTX 3080 with crashing, and I really wouldn't recommend buying the Zotac card right now, especially because it is literally a cut down, cheap as possible RTX 3080 design with a base VRM and a cheaper capacitor setup behind the GPU. So I would avoid it. This is one card that I would avoid right now. They might fix it in the future, but right now it also has the worst power limit potential for overclocking. The stock power limit is 320 watts, just like the Founders Edition. So if you're running it stock, I guess it doesn't really matter, the power limit design, because it's only 320 watts, and they only put dual 8 pins, so that makes sense. But the maximum increased power limit for overclocking is only 336 watts, which is the lowest power limit out of all the cards that has been reviewed by reviewers, because it seems like Zotac themselves aren't confident that their cooler or VRM can handle the increased power from overclocking, so they just set it up as the lowest one compared to MSI, Palit, Nvidia, or Asus, which has a much higher power limit than they do for overclocking. So yeah, I would definitely avoid the Zotac card. And now for the Gigabyte Gaming OC or Eagle OC cards, which are basically the same cards. These cards don't have that many in-depth reviews yet on the internet, so what I've found from these cards is that it basically has a cooler that's possibly slightly better than the MSI card, so even though it's a bit of a smaller card than the MSI, it's a bit better, and that's possibly because Gigabyte is using a copper base plate, unlike MSI, who's using a direct touch heat pipe, which, you know, it's kind of been known in GPUs design right now that, you know, direct touch heat pipes don't work that well for GPUs, and you really need a copper base plate to spread the heat. So if you're looking for a quiet and cool card, I guess the Gigabyte is quite a good option, but actually don't go buy the Gigabyte card right now, because even though it has a pretty decent VRM, which is still reference spec, just like the MSI, it's a 13-phase 50 amp power setup, it's actually not that great, because like the Zotac card, Gigabyte seem to have skimped out on the capacitor setup behind the GPU, and they have used the cheaper post caps instead of the more expensive MLCC caps, which again, like the developing situation we're in right now with the RTX 3080, it seems like these cheaper post caps are causing the crashing issue. So again, I would definitely try to avoid this card as well as the Zotac card because of the capacitor issues, until it's cleared up whether that's really causing the issues or if, you know, they're changing the capacitors in the future revisions of the card. But either way, even though this card's pretty good, it also has another weird design decision, which is that Gigabyte decided to extend the 8-pin cables to the end of the cooler instead of right on the PCB, so it might not be even the greatest card for water cooling and stuff, because you might have a cable extension just hanging on the end of the card that you don't really know how to hide. So yeah, I would not recommend Gigabyte card all that much, even though it has a pretty good cooler. They do increase the power limit on the board to 340 or 350 watts. I think it should be above the Asus card, so it's possibly 350 or 360 watts. It's just that there's not a lot of reviews that have tested this for sure, but it seems like it does draw the most power out of all the RTX 3080, so it does have a higher potential clock speed at stock and maybe when overclock, although I have not seen a reviewer that has tested that either. Now for the last card that has been reviewed a lot, it's the Palit RTX 3080 Gaming Pro, which has been reviewed by a few outlets. And this card is not available in the US, I think, as far as I know. It's mostly in the European market and also the Asian market. And this is one of the more decent RTX 3080 that's also affordable. Now the problem with the Palit Gaming Pro card is that the cooler is not the best at all. In fact, the temperatures are pretty close to the Founders Edition card, and the noise levels are only slightly reduced as well. So while it is still slightly better than the Founders Edition, it is a triple slot card, so you would expect it to be a lot better. And I would think some of the issue would have something to do with the card covering a lot of the fans area using the shroud. So I don't think that's the smartest design choice for Palit here. But this card has a really more compact design, and I think it'll fit in a lot more ITX cases, for example. So if you're looking for an ITX build, this might be the best bet because it's not the thickest and the widest card there is, unlike the Asus and the MSI, yet it still has pretty good temperatures. And I haven't really seen that much complaints about this card crashing because apparently they also did not cheap out like Zotac with the VRM design. Although they did use a reference design, they used a 14 phase instead of a 13 phase like MSI and Zotac. So it's still a bit above the reference spec in that it's a 14 phase by 50 amp instead of 13 phase by 50 amp like the Zotac and MSI. And Palit have also seemed to have put some MLCC caps behind the GPU, which is said to be better than the POSCAPs that are apparently possibly causing crashes. So that is not confirmed yet, but I would really avoid any card that doesn't have MLCC caps behind the GPU. So the way you'll see this is that MLCC caps are the very tiny capacitors that are littered in a group behind the GPU, while the POSCAPs are the big square rectangular black capacitors that you see behind the GPU. So if you see cards with just all POSCAPs like the Zotac card, I would definitely avoid it, and I would try to get the cards with the most MLCC caps, in which case this is the Asus RTX 3080 TUF Gaming at this point in time. And so because the Palit card has a pretty decent VRM that's above the reference spec, I would rate it above the Zotac. So if you could get the Palit card over the Zotac card, which, if you're looking for a compact card, the Zotac is also compact, I would just get the Palit over it for sure. Now for the power limits for overclocking, it seems like Palit also has put a 350 watt power limit just like MSI, and their stock power limit is like the Founders Edition, which is 320 watts, so that's all fine I guess, because they don't put a triple 8-pin setup like MSI, which is absolutely ridiculous again. But it's still less than the Nvidia Founders Edition and the Asus TUF Gaming, which is 375 watts for the TUF Gaming and 370 watts for the Nvidia Founders Edition. So yeah, if you want to go for overclocking, again, go for the Asus TUF. Or if you want to put a water block, maybe the Founders Edition or Asus TUF, it doesn't really matter which one you buy because they have the highest power limits possible at this point in time. Anyways, for the conclusion of this video, basically I would rate the Asus TUF Gaming RTX 3080 on the top as it has the best cooler and the best VRM setup as well as the best capacitor setup behind the GPU. So you really can't go wrong with that one, which is kind of funny because the Asus TUF series has long since been kind of criticized for crappy cheap components on some of their cards, especially like the RX 5700 XT and 5600 XT series before, but it seems like they have turned that around and make this one of the best RTX 3080 cards hands down right now. And I would rate the Nvidia Founders Edition card as the second card because it does have a pretty solid PCB VRM design and also capacitor setup, so it shouldn't have any crashing issues either. And it also has a pretty decent cooler, even though it's just a compact 2-slot design, which is another plus if you're using a small computer build like an ITX case, for example. And as the third card in the list, I would say the MSI deserves that spot because it does have possibly the second or third best cooler, kind of exchanging spots with the Gigabyte card really. And it does have an okay VRM setup as a reference design, especially because it has some MLCC caps behind the GPU, which is better than all POSCAPs like the Gigabyte and the Zotac cards. And as the fourth place, I would place the Palit Gaming Pro as well, because it does have the more expensive MLCC caps behind the GPU, so it seems like their engineers of these cards that I've listed just now have actually found problems with using just all POSCAPs and decided to use MLCC caps to provide more stability. So hopefully these cards really don't have any crashing issues. And so I would really avoid the Gigabyte and Zotac cards, which I would place 5th and 6th, because I would put the Gigabyte card before the Zotac card simply because it has a better cooler and a higher power limit. But they really can't be recommended right now because of the situation of the crashing RTX 3080s, which are again possibly caused by the caps. So I would just avoid all cards which has the cheaper POSCAPs instead of the MLCC caps. And yeah, that's about it for this video. If you do enjoy it and you found this useful, please leave a like or comment what you think about this situation with the RTX 3080. And please subscribe to my channel if you want to see more of my future videos, which might include real life actual like testing of an RTX 3000 card in my hand. But that's only a speculation right now. I'm not too sure how I can get one yet. But yeah, thank you for watching this video. Hope you enjoyed it.